Hello, welcome. We're going to talk in this video about Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. In our last video, we talked about the theopolitical sects in the time of Jesus, late Second Temple Judaism. And in the video before that, we talked about messianic expectations in late Second Temple Judaism, the time of Jesus. So we're going to go on today, and we're going to finish up Judaism here. Put myself down in the corner here, and let's get started. First of all, there we go. Synagogues and rabbis. We've talked some about this, but let me reiterate a little bit here. Synagogue, as we said, means gathering. We don't really have special buildings, special synagogue buildings that we have found, archaeologically speaking, until we get to about the time of Jesus. In the time of Jesus, we start finding buildings that are specifically dedicated to synagogue gatherings, especially in communities that, of course, have the money to spend to build special buildings for synagogue gatherings. When we get, 2 or 3 centuries in the future, there are plenty of synagogues all over the place. But again, synagogues start as a gathering, not necessarily a building. There begun during the Babylonian exile and continued after the return to Judea, as we talked about. We don't really have any records of synagogue meetings before the Babylonian exile of the Jews. So it is, in my opinion, very sensible to believe that they began during the exile, because of course the people could not go to the temple. The temple was destroyed and they were exiled to another land. And so they began meeting in these informal groups that continue after they come back to their land, as we talked about in the Judaism 4 video. Now, there's always only one temple. The temple is in Jerusalem. We're in the period of the Second Temple, which they build after they come back from the Babylonian captivity under the Persian Empire. But there's synagogues in every Jewish town or village all over the world, wherever the Jews have ended up. Synagogues are not at all like temple rituals. There's no priest. There's no sacrifice. They're a lot more what you would think about if you thought about synagogues today, or church meetings, or something like that. They start out being run by laymen, and they involve reading and study of the Tanakh and a prayer to God, and of course beginning with prayers of God restoring them back to their land as he had promised to them through the prophets when they were taken exile. By the Common Era, when we get Common Era, of course, meaning AD, in the year of our Lord, or after the year that Jesus is supposed to have been born, which is off by 6 or 7 years, we come to a new era where we do have synagogue elders, and the rabbis. Again, we've talked a lot about the rabbis, but they tend to dominate, hold authority, do a lot of the teaching, and it is in this whole network of synagogues that the major rabbis have come to prominence and gained a following. Rabbinic midrash is often a feature. Midrash is scriptural exposition. Very similar if you go to a Christian church or something and your pastor is taking a scriptural passage and trying to unpack what it really means to you in terms of your practice daily. This is very similar to what rabbinic midrash is. The most notable rabbis emerge as elders and spiritual leaders of the people, and most rabbis in the late Second Temple Judaism period are Pharisees. And we've talked about this before. The term synagogue, again, does not refer to dedicated buildings until the Common Era. And we talked about also, when we were going through the Jewish sects, and we talked about the Pharisees, we talked about the Pharisee rabbis teaching the tradition of the elders. This is what it is called in the Gospels. And Jesus, as we mentioned, gives them some flack for seeming to judge people's righteousness more on how people are keeping their tradition, the tradition of the elders, what scholars call today the Oral Torah, rather than the law of God itself. And when we get to the teachings of Jesus, we're going to talk a lot more about this. And we're also going to talk about more things that Jesus takes the Pharisee rabbis to task on. Anyway, this tradition of elders, or the Oral Torah, is transmitted verbally from the rabbis to their disciples for generations, and is later compiled in the Mishnah, circa 200, and we mentioned this again, but by the end of the 2nd century CE, remember the temple's destroyed in 70, And the second revolt in 135, which we'll reiterate here when we get to the timeline on the next slide, After that, the Jews are actually kicked out of Jerusalem and the area in Judea around Jerusalem, and they can't even live there anymore. And this is the great diaspora, or the great dispersion. And at this point, since Jews are spread so far around the world, apparently the rabbis are concerned that maybe this oral tradition might not be passed on exactly the same way in different areas. And so they want to assure the stability of the transmission. So for the first time, they actually write down this oral Torah, this tradition of the elders. And as we mentioned, again, talking about the Pharisees, this is called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah literally means repetition. And this is written down in the last decade of the 2nd century CE. Now, we also mentioned, just to bring to your remembrance, in the last decade of the 1st century CE, about 30 years or so after the destruction of the temple is when the 1st century ends. What's happening then? Remember, this is when we are codifying the Tanakh. This is when the rabbis are making the final decisions of what books actually belong in the authoritative, inspired corpus of the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible. And of course, there's many other things that people are reading that they consider to be inspired, but they do not make it into the Tanakh. That's the end of the 1st century CE. The end of the 2nd century CE is when the rabbis, the Pharisee rabbis, who have been in control since the destruction of the temple, since the priests were removed, now the Pharisee rabbis, they're the leaders. That's why we call it rabbinical Judaism after the temple is destroyed. They're the ones that compiled the Mishnah in the last decade of the 2nd century CE. Moving on here, let's just finish up the timeline. Let me move me a little bit out of the way so I can get out of the way at this last little date there. There we go. All right, so crucifixion of Jesus is going to be somewhere between about 29 and 33. And I won't tell you all the different reasons for the dating theories, but just, think somewhere around 30. The revolt against Rome breaks out in 66 and is actually crushed by Rome in 70. Again, we've mentioned this before. This should be familiar to you. By the Roman general Titus. Actually, Vespasian, his father, is the one who begins the attack, but he's actually called back to Rome to be declared a god or something, and so his son Titus actually is the one who finishes the conquest of Jerusalem. And as we talked about before, the temple is destroyed as punishment for the revolt against the Roman Empire. The Tanakh canon is established somewhere in the 90s by the Jewish rabbis, as we just mentioned. There's another revolt that breaks out in 132 and lasts until 135. We call the Bar Kokhba revolt, because the guy who leads it, a lot of people think that he is the Messiah that was promised, and they call him the son of the star. And there's actually many messianic prophecies. This one we didn't actually talk about, but there's one in the Torah that talks about the son of the star that will be raised up, and so they think that this guy is the guy. Of course, he apparently isn't, because the Jews, again, get defeated by the Romans, and this time they're actually kicked out of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem has already been largely destroyed, but after they're kicked out in 135, what happens is Jerusalem is leveled. Whatever's left of their buildings are leveled, and it is rebuilt as a new Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, and Jews, as we said, are forbidden to live there. So this is what we call the Great Diaspora, or the Great Dispersion. Now, the word can be used in many ways just to refer to dispersed Jews, but when you talk about the Great Diaspora, this is the expelling of the Jews after the second revolt in 135. We talked about compiling the Mishnah. It's compiled by Judah Anasi, or Judah the Prince, around 200, the last, as we said, decade of the 2nd century. Now, what ends up happening with the Mishnah is it has a whole bunch of commentaries added to it until it becomes something called the Talmud. So we're going to talk about this, but first let me tell you why we needed the commentaries by better explaining what the Mishnah in fact is and how it's laid out. The Mishnah, as we said, is the oral Torah, the tradition of the elders. And everything in this first paragraph here, we've already really talked about, and so it should be familiar to you. Let's jump down to where it says the Mishnah is mainly comprised of halakha. This means how to keep your responsibility to God, how to walk with God. Halakha is about practice, okay? Some people say it's the legal teaching, and okay, it is, but when we think legal today, we're thinking of something very, very different than what they're thinking about when they say legal. Legal just means, what you're required to do to fulfill your religious responsibility. So it's about practice. And there are other sections that are more about other things. Haggadah is more about stories and narratives and so on. And I'm not going to make you learn all the terms, but I would like you to know the term halakha. It is important because that's what the Mishnah is, how to practice your faith. And we already talked about why we need this oral Torah. We need this direction, how to practice your faith, because it's been, a good 1,500 years since Moses received the Torah. And in 1,500 years, the whole world has changed. Their society is very, very different than it was back then. Kind of like today, if we would look back, say to the time of Jesus or the time of the, beginning of Christianity as a powerful force in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century, many things have changed since then. And a lot of the things that are said in the New Testament or the different kinds of decrees of the councils that are made in the 3rd and 4th centuries, you can't just apply them, to our society and our style of life today without a whole lot of interpretation, a whole lot of reapplication, if you will, just because society and culture has changed so much since then. And we mentioned this before. Again, this should all be familiar to you. This is new. The Mishnah is arranged in 6 topical sections, and they're by different themes, different topics. And so they do not follow the structure of the Torah or the structure of the Tanakh at all. They're also not chronological. They're by theme, by topic. So what we need is some kind of a commentary that takes these different directions in the topical sections and relates them back to the places in the Hebrew Bible where they're actually talked about. And so that's what we need a commentary for here. And the commentary added to the Mishnah is going to be the main center of what we call the Talmud. So let's move on from here. The commentary that we're talking about here on the second line is called the Gemara. And the Gemara literally means, as you'll see down a couple more lines, it means completion. So it's added to the Mishnah. And how does it complete the Mishnah? It relates it back to the actual scriptures that the different precepts in the Mishnah are gleaned from. Now, when you put these two things together, they become the heart of what over the centuries becomes a huge compendium of rabbinic literature that we call the Talmud. Talmud means the instruction or the teaching, the learning. It could mean the studying. So again, Mishnah, the repetition, the oral Torah, plus Gemara, the completion, linking it back to the scriptures, which are the legitimation for the different teachings in the Mishnah, together make the heart of the Talmud. But there are also many other things added to the Talmud, commentaries from different rabbis and sages and so on, and or many different Tosafot, as we call them, different additions. And for different sections of the Bible, obviously there's different kinds of additions. A lot of the commentaries don't necessarily agree with each other. Different sects of Judaism may follow more the interpretation of one rabbi, whereas another sect may follow more the interpretation of another rabbi in the Talmud. So the Talmud has many different viewpoints on different parts of the Mishnah. Now, there are 2 actual Talmuds. The first is completed a couple hundred years at most before the second one. We call the first one the Yerushalmi, or the Jerusalem Talmud. Probably more correctly should be called the Palestinian Talmud, because as we said, the Jews aren't really allowed to live around Jerusalem. And so most of the Jews that are involved in this are living farther north in the Galil. So, and also because the land is no longer called Judah, after the revolt was crushed by the Romans, they changed the name to Palestine, which, by the way, is the same word as the ancient word Philistine, which back when the kingdom of Israel was first being established under Saul and David, the Philistines were the main competing nation challenging this new nation of Israel. So it's really kind of an insult that the Romans are changing the name back to Philistine, almost like saying this is the last kingdom that ruled here that we're willing to acknowledge now. So a lot of times it'll be called the Palestinian Talmud, completed by the 5th century at the latest. And this is embraced mainly by what we call Sephardic Jews. And these are Jews that end up settling in the diaspora in the Mediterranean area. In other words, Southern Europe, Northern Africa, East, the Middle East, Egypt. There is another Talmud that is produced by the scholars in Babylon. Now, if you remember way back in Judaism 4, we talked about the Jews coming back from their exile in Babylon, and we said a lot of Jews stayed in Babylon because they had good lives there. Not even the majority of them came back to the land. So here we are 1,000 years later, and we see these Babylonian Jews producing a different version of the Talmud. It's actually a lot longer, and they take up to a couple hundred years longer to actually complete it. So it's by the 6th century that this is completed. And we find out in history that this particular Talmud is embraced more by what we call Ashkenazi Jews. And they're the ones that settled more in northern and eastern Europe. So when we think about, for instance, the Jews that were the 6 million people that were killed genocidally by the reign of Adolf Hitler, most of them being Jews, those are Ashkenazi Jews. Now, both Talmuds, of course, are today used in Israel. Israel became a nation again in 1948, was resettled after the Holocaust. And both of them are in use in Israel today because, of course, both Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews immigrated to Israel and settled there. So again, what you really need to know is that the heart of the Talmud is the Mishnah and the Gemara, and know what these different parts are. I'm not going to ask you about the additional Tosafot. This is the first page in the Bavli Talmud, or the Babylonian Talmud. And the next page here, I have it color-coded. And you can see here the Mishnah section at the very top center. And you can see the color coding there on the side. This is the original. Right below it, you have a section about the same size, a little bit, a few more words there. That's actually the Gemara. And so everything else around this are other Tosafots that are added, and some of them are named here. Now, you're not going to have the same scholars commentating on different parts of the Bible, but in this part, it actually names, 3 of the different, comments here, and just talks about different Tosafos. Those are people that add the Tosafot, the other additions. And again, all you really need to know here about this is that the Talmud is a huge compendium of rabbinic literature that is actually being added to for centuries. Today, if you got the Bavli Talmud, I think the authoritative edition is like 20 volumes or something. I mean, it's absolutely huge. Moving on here, I want to talk about some major movements in Judaism, and you have this page here in your slides. I'm going to actually use some bigger print and move it on 2 different pages here. And just want you to understand some of these major movements. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly here. First of all, Kabbalah is the major mystical movement in Judaism. Kabbalah means tradition. And, much like the Oral Torah, if you will, the Kabbalists say that their tradition here, their mystical tradition, goes way, way back to, before the Second Temple period. And some people believe that, but you can't really prove it. The Book of Splendor, or the Zohar as it is, which is the main writing in Kabbalah, is certainly written during the Talmudic period after the destruction of the temple and the diaspora. Some scholars date it as late as like the 9th century. Again, some say the tradition was very well established before the destruction of the temple and finally put in writing in the next couple centuries after that. When we talk about mystical traditions, we have mystical traditions in all of the devotional religions. Now, when I use the term mystical, some people broaden the definition of that, but I don't want to broaden the definition so much that it loses its meaning. Mystical is a movement. Obviously, the word comes from mystery, but a mystic, or someone who's involved in a mystical movement, when we talk about the mystery they're pursuing the mystery of their connection to God. They're pursuing the ultimate intimacy that they can have with God. They're pursuing the ultimate experience of God's presence and power in their life. And most of the very famous mystics were renunciants. You don't apply yourself as fruitfully to pursue this kind of a relationship with God. If you are tasked with running a business and running a family and so on, so you normally see them as renunciants. And maybe you're familiar with some of the major mystics, but there are very important mystics in Christianity, in Islam, and also in Judaism, and in devotional Hinduism, Bhakti Hinduism, which focuses on worship. There are mystics there. In fact, in Hinduism, we talked about one of them named Ramakrishna, who spent his life pursuing the greatest intimacy that he could find with God, in his case, with Brahman through the goddess Kali, for whom he was a priest. So a little bit about mystical movements, and we'll mention mystical movements again, in Christianity and Islam, of course. Now, Hasidic Judaism begins in the Enlightenment period, and it is an experientially based movement inspired by a guy named Israel ben Eliezer, and people call him popularly the Baal Shem Tov, which means the master of the good name. Baal means master or Lord. By the way, you've probably heard the word Baal referring to a false god, but Baal just means Lord. I mean, if the Canaanites were not already calling their gods Baal, the Israelites might have used that name for theirs, but it referred to gods they did not acknowledge as being real gods or the proper gods to worship. So Baal kind of became the name, of any idol that the Israelites rejected. But in fact, it just means Lord or master. So Shem means name, and Tov means good. So it's the master of the good name. And when I say experientially based, we sometimes call this charismatic. It's focused on experience and devotion. And religious scholarship, okay, important, but it's all about experiencing God. Now, this might seem very similar to mysticism, and it is. But when we talk about charismatic movements, the main difference between mysticism and charismata is that in charismatic movements, it comes from the word gift, by the way, in the Greek, charis. And so when the group comes together, they believe that God blesses them for coming together and reveals his presence and reveals his gifts in the midst, and they have this powerful emotional experience for the presence of God. But since they're seeking this as a group and they're coming together to experience this, we tend to call this charismatic. And mystical tends to, generally, when you talk about important mystics, most of the revelations that they experience, most of the feeling they have of closeness with God has happened in solitude when they were alone meditating. So that's the big difference. Anyway, so this is kind of a charismatic movement, a very conservative movement in terms of their devotion to the experience of God and God's Spirit. But this movement was initially rejected by Orthodox Judaism completely. Now, this is interesting to understand because sometimes we forget that things change rapidly going throughout history. People that are friends today may have been enemies 100 years ago. People that were enemies, 30, 40 years ago might be friends today. And we see many examples of this. We used to be friends with Osama bin Laden, if you didn't know that. We were involved in helping in Afghanistan, helping them to resist the movement of Russians into their land. Of course, Osama bin Laden ended up being one of our worst enemies. We also were friends with Saddam Hussein at one point. And again, he ended up being one of our worst enemies. So things change throughout history. In terms of mystical movements, this is important. Mystical movements often are rejected by whatever sects of the religion are considered the most theologically orthodox or scripturally orthodox. They often reject mystical movements in the beginning, but then later on come to find a way to accept them. When we get to Islam and we talk about Sufism or Sufi Islam, we'll see the same kind of pattern where it's initially rejected by Sunni Islam, but later on is accepted. Anyway, the reason Hasidic Judaism is initially rejected by Orthodox Judaism is because of this idea that, all of your Torah learning and study is worth absolutely nothing if you're not having this personal experience of God's intimacy, God's Spirit. And so the Orthodox rabbis, of course, are not fans of anything that says that all of their study is kind of worthless. Now, the rejection doesn't last that long. I mean, we end up with many Hasidic leaders that are actually Torah scholars, and by the second generation of Hasidic leaders, their position is much better clarified as to say that, yes, study of the Torah is extremely important but it's extremely important as it leads you to a real experience of the power and presence of God in your life. And the Orthodox rabbis have no problem with that kind of a conclusion, if you will. And today, of course, many people, would not know the difference between ultra-Orthodox Judaism or Hasidic Judaism or heretic Judaism, and we're not going to get into all the differences today. We will talk a little bit about the different forms of Judaism in the U.S., but to talk about the different forms of Judaism in Israel, we just don't really have time. And it's a little bit more complicated since we don't live in Israel, and I have to tell you a whole lot more about the tensions between the different groups, and unfortunately there's just not time. But again, it's very nuanced today. But Hasidic Judaism, again, very much alive and well. Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism is the ultra-conservative sect even to this day, but they're the ones who continued the rabbinic traditions of the post-temple period and stressed Torah study. So they are the theological descendants, if you will, of the Pharisee rabbis. Now, once we get past the period of the Second Temple, they don't usually refer to themselves as Pharisees anymore. They're just called the rabbis. I mean, they are the leaders of Judaism. They don't really have any competing sects at all. As we said, the priests, the Sadducees, are removed from power. The Essenes are completely wiped out at the end of the first revolt. So, I mean, Pharisees are the authority, and so after that first century, you don't even hear them called Pharisees anymore, but the rabbis are the theological descendants of the Pharisee sect. Now, they believed in continued segregation of the Jewish community from greater society. Now, let me talk about this before we go on beyond this, because we need to just very quickly say that throughout the history of Judaism, they're probably the most persecuted people that have ever lived. And they were persecuted more by Christians, both Catholics and later by Protestants, after the birth of Protestantism in the early 16th century, than by anyone else ever. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to later Christianity. But suffice to say that once Christianity actually stops being persecuted, and then later on, in the 3rd century, actually becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity is responsible for repressing and outright persecuting Jews many times during the 1600 years after that, culminating in the ultimate persecution of the Jews, the genocide that we call the Shoah or the Holocaust. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this happened and the kind of theologies that were developed by Christians to demonize Jews. And it's kind of a sad story, but I don't want to get into the whole thing here. But suffice to say that Jews were generally prohibited from owning businesses, from owning land. They didn't have the same civil rights as most other people, not only just in the Roman Empire, but all of the other different nations that they end up being spreaded to, with a few exceptions. Now, later on, we get to a point where they actually gain full civil rights, and we'll talk about France and Germany, but for the better part, 1,400 years, they are a persecuted people. And the reason that they are segregated is not just because the Orthodox rabbis think they should be. They're segregated because society forces them to be. In fact, if you've heard the term ghetto to refer to a poor section of the city or a slum or whatever, the word ghetto actually is a word that talks about the area of the city where Jews were quarantined and were required to live apart from other people. That's where the term comes from. So this separation, this segregation, this dehumanization, this lack of civil rights, this is not something the Jews necessarily chose, but it's something that they legitimated, and the ultra-Orthodox rabbis basically said, yes, we should stay separate. We're a chosen people. Now, this is not a problem when Protestant society or Catholic society does not want you to be an equal part of society. But when this starts generating some debate is when we get to the later Enlightenment era. And for the first time in some countries, some European countries, they've kind of had equal civil rights in some of the more Muslim-led countries in Northern Africa and stuff, but not in the Christian countries. And when they gain full civil rights in France and Germany, this is a wonderful era for the Jews. And it doesn't last long. As you know, in France, there's a big scandal because apparently some Jewish official is accused of, some kind of betrayal. It's called the Dreyfus Affair. You can look it up if you want. We'll talk a little bit more about Germany here. Germany, obviously, after World War I, and Germany being defeated and having to make reparations, they have horrible financial problems, and somehow the Jews end up being the scapegoat for all their financial problems. And so this equal civil rights and this prosperity of the Jews doesn't last long, because what happens is their prosperity ends up being resented. Now, the Jews end up being very, very good financiers. They're very good at lending money and managing money. And how did they get so good at that? Well, they couldn't own businesses. They couldn't own land. And so they did the only kind of business that they could actually do. And they became very, very good at lending money. And throughout the medieval period, you'll find that a lot of kings owed certain Jewish financiers a lot of money because it cost money to go to war. And sometimes the very rich people that would actually lend kings and dukes and earls money would be Jewish financiers. So they have a long history of being good with money. So once they get equal civil rights in Germany, they're very, very successful. And now they can actually have stores. They can own businesses. And they're just as successful in store owners as they were as bankers, or as they continue to be as bankers. And it ends up causing resentment. Now, we'll talk more about the Holocaust a little bit later. But for now, let's talk about the period where they are doing well before the movement, of course, that's led by Adolf Hitler and becomes the Third Reich. Until that happens, they're doing fine. But now we have a problem. Once you are a full citizen, you can now, for instance, send your children to like the real universities. They don't have to just go to the Jewish yeshivas. Now you can actually own businesses, in the main part of town. Now you can live in other parts of the town. You don't have to stay in the ghetto. And so a lot of the Jews are grabbing this opportunity to move out. And this is, as we're going to see on the next slide, the birth of Reform Judaism. Now, Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism did not believe that you should leave the ghettos. They did not believe that you should, send your kids to the real universities when they were grown. They believed that you should stay separate. That's what they've already done. There were a lot of Jews that didn't agree with that at all. They didn't despise their Judaism necessarily, but they thought, why not avail ourselves of the advantages of being full citizens of Germany? And these are called Reform Jews. This is the birth of Reform Judaism. It's a response to the Orthodox resistance to opportunities that the Jews, that were available to the Jews from newly obtained civil rights. I won't ask you by name, but Moses Mendelssohn is a great scholar, usually seen as the founder of Reform Judaism. And he, advocated that Jews should leave the ghettos, integrate with greater society, and use that advantage, to help themselves, promote Judaism, whatever. And so Reform Jews sought to be seen as full citizens, whereas the Orthodox Jews, obviously, their identity was more as a Jew. A Reform Jew, their identity is more as a German. And so, pick your noun, pick your adjective. For instance, an Orthodox Jew would say, I'm a German Jew. I am a Jew first and foremost, and I happen to be in Germany. Whereas a Reform Jew might say, I'm a Jewish German. I'm a German citizen, proud of that, love my country, and I happen to be of Jewish descent. So, what is your main identity here? Anyway, Reform Judaism went very, very far in modifying their worship. In fact, at one point in Germany, they were changing their traditional music, and it sounded a whole lot more like the pipe organ hymns that were being played in Lutheran churches, and they adopted that. Some of them actually started meeting on Sunday instead of on the Sabbath, Shabbat, which is Sabado, Saturday. And, of course, the Orthodox thought that they'd gone far too far and had, despised their religion, left their religion. Now, what ends up happening much later, and actually this really takes off later in America, but there's another movement called Conservative Judaism. It's not as conservative as Orthodox. Orthodox is always the most conservative. But conservative Judaism is kind of like a middle ground between Reform and Orthodox, because there's just such a broad divide between them. Conservative Jews still are kind of hanging on to a more formal sort of worship, but they do not believe that they have to be completely segregated or separated from people that are not part of their group. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you don't really have much to do with anyone that's not an Orthodox Jew. You know, an Orthodox Jew, if he needs a loaf of bread, he's going to go to a store that's run by an Orthodox Jew to buy the loaf of bread, if it's possible. A conservative Jew, you know, has friends that maybe are Reform Jews or maybe friends that aren't Jews at all. They don't have this kind of restriction. They integrate with society, but they still are a lot more conservative or traditional in how they understand their covenant and how they practice their religious ritual and so on. Reform Jews are more open to changing, you know, just about anything. They believe that their religion is more open and changing, and they should embrace the changes, you know, whatever makes their religion more meaningful in a new kind of society and culture today. So again, most Orthodox, or most conservative is Orthodox. Reform is the most liberal. And then in the middle, conservative Judaism, kind of spanning the two. You might have friends, if you're not a Jew, not an Orthodox Jew, you might have friends that are Reform Jews. You might even have some friends that are conservative Jews. I seriously doubt you've got any friends that are, you know, ultra-Orthodox Jews, because they don't tend to have relationships with people outside of their own segregated religious groups. Zionism, back to Europe here, Zionism is a movement that was going on, by the way, long before the Holocaust. People who really wanted to reestablish a Jewish homeland. And once they were gaining, you know, fuller civil rights and stuff, this seemed like something that maybe was possible. And of course, their preferred Jewish homeland was Israel. And so Zionism wanted to reestablish their homeland in Israel. Now, strangely enough, this is rejected by the Orthodox rabbis either. And it's not as strange as you might think when you think about what happened all the way back with the two revolts against Rome. These are people that claimed to be messiahs that came and led these revolts, and the people followed them into battle and got their butts kicked. And so at that point, the Pharisee rabbis, way back then, made up their minds this was never going to happen again. They made up their minds that when Messiah comes, he, by his power, you know, and the armies of God or whatever, is going to establish his kingdom, and then, you know, we, of course, will follow him. But the whole idea that you're supposed to start a war, you know, and once you start the war, you know, and you set up the kingdom, then the Messiah will appear. They've rejected that for many centuries. They've rejected that idea. So Zionism looks like that same kind of idea, that we want to set up God's kingdom, after which the Messiah will appear. So the Orthodox completely reject that. Now, we're talking, you know, again, 18th century here into the 1800s. And, you know, today, very different situation in Israel. Obviously, we have Orthodox Jews in Israel. You know, they really had not much choice but to emigrate there after the Holocaust. But even though they are in Israel, they stay very, very separate from other kinds of Jews, whether they're conservative, Reform, whether they're secular. They really have nothing to do with other kinds of Jews. They have their own sections of the city. They stay completely separate, and they still don't believe the nation of Israel was set up the right way. In fact, they believe that a lot of the problems that they are experiencing is because Israel was not set up in the right way. It was set up by the power of men. It was set up as a democracy, not as, you know, a country ruled by God as it should be. And anyway, again, something a little more in depth than I have time to go into. Zionism, again, is this idea that Jews should go back and resettle their land. Now, after the Holocaust, Jews really didn't have too much choice. They couldn't really stay, you know, in the places where all of their homes had, you know, been destroyed or taken away from them. They had nothing, you know, all of their money and their belongings had been confiscated or destroyed. They really didn't have much choice. And so Israel was resettled with some assistance from the British and from the Americans. And of course, the Palestinians who had been living there, you know, for, you know, going on 2,000 years since the Jews were kicked out of there, were being displaced by the Jews. And of course, they didn't deserve that. You know, they weren't the ones that persecuted the Jews, and had nothing to do with anything to do with persecution of the Jews. You know, they just wanted to live in peace in their land. So the Jews came back and basically said, you know, hey, spent 2,000 years, but we're home. Get out. And it's a real problem. And you probably know about the Palestinian-Jewish conflict that has been going on for decades since Israel declared itself a nation again in 1948, and by the way, even before then. And it's a very difficult situation. Both sides really have a case. If you think you understand clearly who's right and who's wrong, then you do not understand the situation, because it's much more nuanced, much more complicated than that. But anyway, Zionism believes in the reestablishing of a Jewish homeland. Zionism today can mean different things because the Jewish homeland's already established. It could mean, for instance, the idea that all Jews should actually go back and become citizens of the nation of Israel. And there are certain organizations that are very much encouraging American Jews and Jews in other nations to emigrate and to become Jewish citizens again, and or offer them some kind of benefit or impetus to actually do this. All right, moving on. Judaism in America today. 4 major sects we've talked about: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. There's one more. It's called Reconstructionists. Now, this is interesting because Reconstructionist is a branch off of conservative Judaism, and they are conservative, but in terms of their cultural tradition, Jewish heritage, not conservative in terms of religious practice. Just to clarify a little bit, let me just remind you of something. When you say someone's a Jew, it can mean all kinds of different things. It can mean you're a practicing Jew. You practice some form of religious Judaism. And then, of course, there's subcategories. It could also mean that you are a Jew by descent. In other words, you literally are a blood descendant of the man Israel, or Jacob, who was Abraham's grandson. To say that you are a Jew can also mean that you are a citizen of Israel. But in an ethnic sense, and this is becoming all the more important today as we talk about diversity and embracing different ethnicities, saying you're a Jew can mean that you very much are holding on to your ethnicity, your cultural history, and embracing it, but not necessarily in a conservative religious way, just in a conservative ethnic cultural way, where you don't want your culture to be assimilated or absorbed or diluted by syncretism with another kinds of culture. So this is Reconstruction, so the smallest group. So these are the 4. I'd like you to know them. Lastly, the holidays, and we've talked about some of these. You can read about them in your book. Passover, we talked about. This was where the angel of death passes over the houses that had the blood on the lintel posts and the doorposts. And we talked about the Feast of Weeks 50 days later, Shavuot. And we talked about the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, which today is giving thanks to God for keeping the Jews safe in the wilderness for 40 years. And a lot of the Jews today, especially in Israel, will actually live in booths or tabernacles in their yard during this holiday, reenacting living in these temporary dwellings that could be moved because they're constantly moving during the 40 years in the wilderness. The high holy days in Judaism are the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, is the new year. And 10 days later is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This is the highest holy day in all of Judaism. That was the day that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies in the temple and would actually make a sacrifice for the sins of Israel. And obviously that hasn't happened since 70 because the temple's been destroyed, but it still is the holiest day in all of Judaism. And it's the day when Jews humble themselves and pray for the mercy of God and confess their sins. And so even though they can't observe it according to the temple ritual, it's still a very, very meaningful, very holy holiday, the highest holy day. The Feast of Lots, or Purim, comes out of the book of Esther, and it is a celebration of a Jewish queen who is unknown to be a Jew, but in the course of the story reveals herself to be a Jew to her husband, the king, once somebody in the government has been plotting a genocide against the Jews. And she doesn't know how it's going to go. I mean, there's a good chance that she's going to end up invoking the wrath of the king by approaching him without being invited or whatever. But it turns out that the king actually sympathizes with her. And when he finds out that one of his officials has tricked him into signing a decree for the genocide of the Jews on a particular day, he can't revoke the decree. A decree of the king can't be revoked, but he issues a new decree that all the Jews are commanded to fight for themselves against anybody that tries to attack them, thus absolutely preventing the genocide. And the only person who really ends up dying is the official that tricked the king into signing this genocide. So it's a wonderful victory for the Jews. However, there aren't really a lot of instructions about how to observe Purim. It's not one of those holidays that goes all the way back to the Torah. Today, Purim happens about the same time as Mardi Gras, and that's kind of the way it's celebrated, with a lot of really joyful partying. A lot of Jews wear costumes, especially in Israel and so on. Interesting holiday. Hanukkah, we talked about. This is the Feast of Dedication. We talked about this in some depth, if you'll remember. Target date 165, where the priestly family that we call the Maccabees, or the Hasmoneans, starts a revolt against the Syrian Greeks called the Seleucids and Antiochus IV, and actually wins back control of their country for a little less than a century. They become the Hasmonean priest kings. We talked a lot about this in the Judaism 4 section. And of course, Hanukkah happens around the same time as Christmas, so some people think it's like, the most important Jewish festival. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but it was very important at the time. It's not in the Bible if you are a Protestant, or if you are a Jew. It's not in the Hebrew Bible. Now, if you're a Catholic, you'll find it in your Old Testament in that section we talked about called the Apocrypha, the books that didn't quite make it into the authoritative, inspired Jewish Bible, but still were considered very important. And in that section, you'll find 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and this tells the whole story. So you'll see Hanukkah there. You can find it in this apocryphal writing if you have a Catholic Old Testament, but it doesn't make it into the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't make it into the Protestant Bible. Shabbat, of course, is the celebration of the seventh day when God rested. This starts at sundown on Friday and goes till sundown on Saturday. Bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah are coming of age festivals for Jewish teenagers, after which they are considered, at least in a ritual way, to be adults, even though they have obviously some more growing up to do. That's all for this. The next section, we're going to go back to Second Temple Judaism, but we're going to talk about the birth of Jesus and his ministry, his miracles, his teachings, and that is Second Temple Judaism as the context and the matrix for the birth of Christianity. And that'll be next time. See you then.